Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Muslim Matters podcast, where we discuss everything under the sun that affects Muslims, such as faith, local and global politics, social media, sex education, civil rights, and family matters, all coming from a traditional Orthodox perspective. Subscribe to our podcast and follow us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on our handle, Muslim Matters, and check out our site daily at MuslimMatters.org.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the Muslim Matters podcast. I am your host, Zainab bint Yunus. Today's episode is about a touchy topic, the portrayal of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, particularly in light of the Hamline University controversy, which we'll explain in a little bit more detail in a bit. Today's guest is Dr. Jonathan A.C. Brown, who is the Al-Walid ibn Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Brown is a Muslim academic with a rich list of publications, including the books Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenges and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy, Slavery in Islam, and Islam and Blackness. He has published articles in the fields of Hadith, Islamic law, Salafism, Sufism, Arabic lexical theory, and pre-Islamic poetry, and is the editor-in-chief at the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Law, and is also the director of research at the Yaqeen Institute. Dr. Brown, welcome to the podcast.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, Hamline University controversy. Is it art, history, or Islamophobia? So just to set the stage for the listeners, what happened at Hamline University? And correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm missing anything here, Dr. Brown. But essentially, at Hamline University, an adjunct professor, Erica Lopez Prater, lost her job after featuring depictions of the religious figure, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, despite her class being focused on Islamic art. So she's a global/art history teacher, and she did provide warnings in advance that she was going to present images that might make students uncomfortable, specifically images of religious figures such as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it was all meant to be in a very respectful spirit of academia. Again, art history. So this is literally a piece of art from specifically Muslim history. And to be clear, I believe this was illustrations of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam created by medieval Muslim Persian artists. Now, unfortunately, the Muslims in that class chose not to leave and then became very upset at this display of the images. And they went and complained, and although the professor did apologize for, any offense taken, for any hurt feelings, she still lost her job. And there came from that just tons of media controversy over this, debates amongst Muslims in particular. And while this is one specific incident that happened recently, this issue of portraying Rasulullah ﷺ has come up in a variety of contexts over, last couple of decades now, right? So that's what we want you to talk about, Dr. Brown. Just your brief take on this, and then specifically starting off with this whole issue of depicting Rasulullah ﷺ. How have Muslims historically dealt with this? How has it played out in our history? How does it play out now?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll answer that question, but I think first it's the kind of we need to kind of disentangle three different issues that are that confront us with this Hamline controversy. The first one is kind of what Muslims/Americans should expect from university education, sort of higher education, secular higher education. And, to what extent should Muslims expect to be presented with material that is, comes from outside their sort of faith positions as Muslims, and whether or not they should demand that or kind of accept it, et cetera, et cetera. That's the first question. The second question is, what do students do, or anyone who feels offended or slighted, how do they deal with that in this day and age, and especially in higher education? And the third question is the one you talked about, which is, how do Muslims? Well, actually, there's really two questions. So one is like, what is the Islamic position on depicting the Prophet ﷺ or viewing pictures of him? And second, and maybe more theoretical one for purposes of Muslims living in the West or even globally, right, is how do Muslims deal with diversity within their own tradition when thinking about what is like acceptable or not acceptable for Muslims, right? So if you say that, you can just imagine, right? If you say that in Islam, it is, it would be inaccurate for a professor to say that in Islam, homosexual relationships are permitted. That would be an inaccurate position in the sense that the vast majority of Muslims throughout history would not have said this was allowed in the Sharia. But of course, there are some Muslims today who say it is, and Muslims have done this, whether or not it was allowed or not, did it in the past. So the question is, like, to what extent should Muslims sort of accept a representation of that diversity in somebody talking about their religious tradition? So these are there's a number of questions. So you asked first about the issue of depicting the Prophet, alayhi salam. So there's not really specific rulings about there are in the last couple of decades, but prior to essentially the late 20th century, as far as I know, Muslim scholars didn't really talk about depicting the Prophet, alayhi salam. There's two reasons for that, because they dealt with this issue essentially with two other issues. One was whether you can depict any creature with souls. This is based on, sometimes people say any creature, but definitely any creature that has a soul. This is based on hadiths, very well authenticated hadiths in Sahih Bukhari and other collections. One in which the Prophet ﷺ Aisha has a curtain that has like an image on it, some surah, some picture on it. And the Prophet sort of doesn't want to go into her chamber with this on the door. It says, angels don't enter. Gabriel told me that angels won't enter a house that has either a surah, like an image, or dogs in it. The second one is the Prophet ﷺ says that if you, the people who make images, who kind of create things with surah, right? And this is usually understood as either a picture, painting, a tapestry, a sculpture, or what's called a relief, like a sort of a sculpture that's kind of has a bit of three-dimensional, has depth to it, but is also kind of affixed to a wall or some kind of backing. That these are all understood as surah. That anybody who makes these surahs on the Day of Judgment, they will be asked to breathe life into these things that they thought they created, right? So these are the main sort of fiqhi anchors for the rulings that would say, and this is, the vast majority of Muslim scholars would agree that you should not create a depiction of anything with a soul, whether it's a picture, painting, wall hanging, sculpture, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting, right? Because there are some dissenting opinions, and you can see where they come from, because you have other very famous, well, maybe not as famous hadiths, but also in Sahih Bukhari, a story in which the Prophet's wives and the Prophet are speaking about churches in Ethiopia. By the way, this is also very interesting because it shows you how aware people in the Hejaz were of kind of life in custom in Ethiopia, just across the Red Sea. So what they talk about is how there were these churches or sort of shrines to saints. What would happen is a sort of a saint, Christian saint would die, right, and people would kind of draw a picture of that person or by their grave. And Prophet says, like, initially this was to kind of commemorate the person and place them on a pedestal as an exemplar, right? Someone who you should imitate and admire.
Place of honor, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And then he approves of this. But then what happens is that it kind of turns into an icon that people start to use in worship, right? So you see that it's almost like the picture is not bad in and of itself. It's when it's the fact that it's a slippery slope to sort of worship of an icon or incorporation of icons.
Right. Essentially, it's a direct link to shirk.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Or slippery slope. Right. So, but that painting, that hadith doesn't detract from those other hadiths I mentioned, which are pretty clear prohibitions. Now, there were a couple of interesting dissenting opinions. One is from a scholar named Al-Qasim bin Muhammad. I think he died around 750 of the Common Era. And what he says is that it's only makruh or disliked to have a picture or an image that's in like a wall hanging or on furniture or something. Another scholar, a tafsir scholar, he dies, I think, in 987 Common Era, so 377 Hijri. His name's Abu Ali al-Farisi. In his tafsir, he talks about how images are only prohibited if they're going to lead to idolatry. Like if they're going to, so you can imagine if you have
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, if you can just imagine, like you have an image of, I'm just going to think of something really stupid, like
Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, Alvin and the Chipmunks or something. I mean, I guess you could worship Alvin. I'm trying to think of something even worse. Let's say you have I'm going to get in big trouble for this. Let's say you have like a sculpture of a butt or something like that,
right?
The rear end. I mean, chances are someone's not going to worship a butt statue. But then again, there's some pretty weird temples in the world, so you never know. So that's his opinion. And then Al-Qurtubi, the famous jurist, and we all know his tafsir. I think he died in 1272 Common Era. He's originally from Spain, but he settles in Upper Egypt. And he says, in the Quran, you have the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam, kind of in the court of Sulaiman, he has jinn that are basically making surahs for him. They're making statues and images for him, certainly statues. And so what Qurtubi says is that this fact shows that that making these things in and of themselves is not prohibited, is not kind of wrong in and of itself. Now, what happens in the late 19th and early 20th century is that people like Muhammad Abdu, who dies in 1905, famous kind of Islamic modernist scholar, Mufti of Egypt, he writes a series of fatwas on artistic representation where he basically argues that he kind of goes back to some of those dissenting opinions I talked about and that idea of the slippery slope. And he says that the prohibition on depicting images is only if there is a risk of them becoming idols. Today, no one is going to, you're not going to, if you have a statue of Ramses or a statue of King Tut or something that you're selling in Cairo, no one is going to go and start worshiping that. That's what he said. So basically he kind of.
Well, that's pretty relevant to his context too. Yeah.
So, okay. So then, now I'm just giving you opinions. The second issue that this falls under, insulting or depicting the Prophet would fall under, is insulting the Prophet, yes. And there it's very clear. I mean, it's very clear that Muslims are not allowed to insult the Prophet, even slightly insult the Prophet, and if you do so, then you're not, you essentially cease being a Muslim, right? Because you're belittling the person who you rely on to bring you God's revelation and explain that revelation. Okay, so that's not really debated. So what happens, like when there's the question of this movie, The Message, in 1977, the famous movie, probably we've all seen it. It's about the life of the Prophet. You don't have Muslim scholars, especially I think Majma' al-Fiqh al-Islami in Mecca, the Islamic Fiqh Academy, I guess it would be called. They give a fatwa that you can't depict the Prophet or the leading companions like the four rightly guided caliphs because there's a risk of belittling them, right? That there's almost nothing you can do that would do justice to these people. So in effect, you're going to be belittling them. Okay, but I mean, but again, that really comes under the rubric of insulting, not under the rubric of depiction, because when you have something like a film or a photograph, although there is debate about photographs, but generally the opinion is it's not creating a surah, an image, because you're just capturing light, right? You're not actually making anything. You're just capturing light that's bouncing off something on film.
It's a reflection of something Allah's already created.
Exactly, yeah. So, okay, so that's the legal rule. So there's really, not, if someone says that Islamic law prohibits the depiction of living things or certainly human beings, that's a pretty good generalization. Yes, there's going to be some dissenting opinion on this, but certainly in Sunni Islam, this is by far and away the majority position. Okay. Now, that being said, right, you have two other things you need to take into account. One is that Muslim artists, and especially, they're generally in the pre-modern period, Muslim artists are like other artists producing works of art for patrons. So how do they make a living? Some rich person, a nobleman or a ruler or something says, you're such a great artist to produce some wonderful picture, and I'm going to sponsor you and you're going to praise me or something like that, or mention my name. And so you can go back. I mean, you go back to like the palaces of the Umayyads, some of the surviving palaces, like the palace of Hisham at Khurbat al-Mafjar, and you see they have straight up statues of the caliph, like holding a sword, of women with cleavage showing, of all sorts of stuff, right? They have statues, they have paintings, they have, and et cetera, right? So, like Mel Brooks says in History of the World Part 1, it's good to be the king. You can do whatever you want. You want to have a statue, you can have a statue. Is it halal? No, but what does anyone do?
But who cares?
Yeah. So, okay. So now what happens in terms of the depiction of the Prophet, alayhi salam, there's a little bit of debate about, are some of the early Umayyad coins depicting the Prophet? I don't think they are. I think they're depicting the Caliph. But definitely in the late 13th century, that's the first very clear image we have. Something that's it's not debated. It's an image of a painting of the Prophet Muhammad. It's in a book of Persian poetry. And then the one that the professor actually showed in the class at Hamline is a late 13th, early 14th century image from the Compendium of Histories, Jamia Tawarikh, which was edited and kind of sponsored and supervised by the Ilkhan, a vizier and scholar Rashid ad-Din, who died in 1318 of the Common Era. And there's numerous pictures of the Prophet ﷺ in this compendium, and they're all very, these are very respectful pictures, right? And he looks kind of like he looks sort of like a Mongol person. I mean, that was just the artistic style. So he doesn't even look Arab. And this is very typical for painting in the kind of Persianate area, whether it's the Ottoman Empire, Iran, North India, Central Asia, from roughly the 1300s to the 1600s and 1700s, is that the kind of artistic style is that everybody basically looks Chinese or Mongol, even if, so it's kind of, it's sort of silly. I mean, you're not actually trying to represent the person accurately.
Of course.
And in this picture, he does not. His face is completely unveiled. He looks like it could be any character. Then what happens is in the kind of 1400s and 1500s, you have this move towards having these halos, like kind of fiery halos around.
Is that when the flame and the veil kind of kicks in?
Yeah, exactly. And then in the 16th century in Iran, they begin this tradition of having actually like a hijab, like a veil over the Prophet's face. Mm-hmm. And then even his family members like Hassan, Hussein, Ali, they would have also like flame halos around their head. So that becomes an artistic style. And I should also add that, and I'm not actually sure how this happens. Someone who's more knowledgeable than me needs to explain this. But in the Shiite tradition in Iran, somehow, they don't seem to have any problem depicting the Prophet. And you see this going back several centuries. But in like the 19th century, you have these incredible pictures that depict like the Day of Judgment happening. And you just see everybody like martyrs and people getting judged, and the Prophet and the Imams. And it's really intense. And then, but today in Iran, someone has to explain this, but they really don't seem to mind at all, because I remember a few years ago, and someone should find this on the internet, I think, they actually had an official competition in Iran to see who could do the most accurate depiction of the Prophet ﷺ based on like the Hilya and the Shama'il and the Hadiths that describe him. So it was actually like almost like a sketch artist.
Right.
But in Iran, like you can walk down the street and you'll see for sale pictures and rugs with images of wall hangings with images of Ali, of Hussein, of the Prophet, of all the 12 Imams. So this is very normal to see in Iran.
So it's like their tradition diverges significantly from ours in that sense.
Yeah.
All right. So that's an interesting overview of the different fiqh opinions and historical precedents, essentially. And I find it particularly fascinating, given everything you've mentioned. A lot of Muslims don't know these things. Now, I don't know the details, but I'm vaguely familiar with it just because I'm a little bit of, I dabble in Islamic history for funsies, so, very casually. But, these things come up, so you're generally aware, like, oh, yeah, this happened. Is it halal? No. But did it happen? Did Muslims do it? And did they do it in good faith? Yes. And one of the things that struck out for me in this whole university, I don't say scandal, but issue, is that the students, I think the MSA students said something along the lines of like, we never heard of this before. We'd never seen it before. And they were very shocked by this. And there are a lot of Muslims, of course, like non-university educated as well, who are also very, very unaware of this. And they assume that any portrayal of Rasulullah ﷺ is automatically insulting and offensive. And I guess that leads to the next issue of there have been many times that illustrations of Rasulullah ﷺ have been weaponized against Muslims by Islamophobes. So things that come to mind are, the Danish cartoons, the whole Charlie Hebdo issue, Pamela Geller and her whole draw the prophet cartoon challenge or something it was quite a few years ago in the States. And obviously those incidents evoked significant agitation from Muslims across the world, and rightfully so, because, the ghira that we have for our Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the fact that this was done very specifically to insult and to provoke. What would you like to essentially tell Muslim students, or Muslims generally, like the difference between these two scenarios, really?
So, first I just want to add that, these images like the Ilkhan Vizier, the Jami Tawarikh image, and the ones produced in the Ottoman Empire in Central Asia, these are all produced by Sunnis. So I want to be clear, like this is not just a Shiite thing. It becomes much more prominent in Iran, in Shiite Iran, Safavid Iran, and post until today. But a lot of this is done by Sunnis. By Sunni rulers patronizing Sunni artists. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean make it right or wrong. I'm just saying that's, we can't just say that everything is done by Shiites.
Right.
So the second thing I'd say is that this brings us to that first issue I brought up, which is like, really, what are we dealing with when it comes to university education? Okay. Mm-hmm. So first of all, just from the perspective of a university or college, or they're not beholden to following the dictates of the Sharia, right? Now, that's because, first of all, the vast majority of students aren't Muslim. Second of all, the vast majority of there's tremendous diversity amongst students. Even if most students are Muslim, like you can't expect the non-Muslims to sort of accept as just by without any kind of evidence why a Muslim sensibility should be indulged.
Right.
The second thing is that, if they're teaching the history of art or history of Islamic civilization, they're just going to do that from their whatever perspective that professor has. Now, that professor could claim to be quote unquote objective, and I'm just telling you what happened, quote unquote. I don't necessarily buy that type of argument because everybody has an agenda, everybody has a point of view. But if somebody says, I'm going to show you really famous pieces of Islamic art, or, like, for example, let's take I remember when I was teaching in University of Washington, Muslim students would come up to me and complain in my Islamic civilization class, like, why are you talking about the disputes amongst the companions after the death of the Prophet? And you're saying that, like, some of them didn't agree with, Abu Bakr being the caliph. And I said, like, this is, nobody debates this. Like, no Muslim scholar debates this. So, you can say that you think we should have a certain perspective. But then I asked a Muslim student, I said, okay, so you're telling me I should do this, but let's say there's Shiite Muslim students in the class, and they're going to come and say to me, why are you saying that it's not totally clear that Ali should have been the caliph or something? And which Muslim student am I supposed to listen to? Like, who gets to define?
The right opinion.
Yeah. So if I say, like, okay, well, I'm just going to teach Islamic history from my perspective because I'm a Sunni, then let's pretend I did that, right? Let's pretend that somehow all the students accepted that, and the non-Muslim students were fine with it, and the non-Sunni students were fine with it. Now I have another issue, which is there's diversity within the Sunni tradition, right? So let's say we come to that question of depicting living things or things with souls. I can give them the majority position, but then if I'm going to be a good scholar, I'm going to also tell them these dissenting positions.
Right.
Or, okay, so let's just say I'm teaching fiqh. So I'm going to teach them the majority position. I'm going to teach them the minority position. I'm going to tell them what the evidence are. I'm going to say what I think the stronger position is. I'm going to allow them to have their opinion. Okay, but they're still going to be exposed to the minority position that allowed some kind of depiction. Now, let's say
outside of even, sorry to cut you off, but yeah, so this is outside even of, a secular academic setting. This is standard for, I would say, pretty much any fiqh class that will say, unless you're sticking to, just your madhab, but even then, within a madhab, there are diverse opinions, and there will be discussion of those opinions and why they came about, and so on and so forth. There's no way really to hide all the other perspectives. Exactly,
right? So then, of course, if you're talking about, I'm going to teach a class on Islamic history, so I'm Muslim, I teach a class on Islamic history. I love Islamic history. I value it. I think of it positively, right? But you can't ignore things that are there that you might not like, that don't go along with what you think should have happened. So even if I think there never should have been a depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, there were, and they were produced by very reverent Muslim scholars. Now, it's important. People ask me, like, I don't understand, Professor Brown, how can you say they were pious, reverent Muslim scholars if they produced these pictures which violated the clear dictates of the Sharia? Well, guess what? There's a lot of variety in the world, and people can have a lot of opinions. So there's this actually one Sufi scholar in the 900s. He talks about how you should look at pictures of, saints or pious figures like the Prophet in order to orient yourself towards them, like to make them centers of your focus. Now, I remember reading this last semester because my students asked me about it. These kind of Javanese shadow puppets that are famous from Indonesia. Mm-hmm. So they don't have, like, the Islamic art museums in Kuala Lumpur, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, Indonesia, they don't actually have these in the Islamic art museums, but these are actually they were prominent parts of Muslim court performances, like where they would perform these like religious stories using these. And it's funny because going back to like the 1600s and 1700s, we have reports about scholars asking, being like, how are you allowed to have these, like, to look at these things? Because these are you're depicting people and you're creating these images. And it's the famous story is that this one kind of Sufi scholar responds to that jurist and says, you're missing the point. That's not the issue. What the issue is, do you understand the meaning of the story, the kind of pious and spiritually enlightening meaning of the story? Now, what you'll notice about both the stories I just told you, both this Sufi scholar from the 900s and the person in the late medieval period talking about the Javanese shadow puppets, is neither of them actually address the issue, right? Neither of them actually say why they're allowing you to draw a picture of a person when the Prophet clearly said you're not allowed to do that. Right. So, look, people are complicated. That doesn't mean that they're not pious. It doesn't mean that they were clearly revering the Prophet, right? So these images, I mean, it's Imam Shadi al-Masri had a really good point about this when he's talking about this Hamline thing. He said, these are beautiful pictures, and pictures that the professor showed. So it's entirely possible that somebody who doesn't know anything about Islam, or even someone who doesn't like Islam, would see these and be like, these are beautiful. And that could actually, improve their opinion and maybe make them, increase the likelihood of them inclining towards Muslims and Islam. So these are a light year away from the Charlie Hebdo pictures or the Danish cartoon pictures, right? Which are just insulting. Now, that gets to another question, which is, people say, Professor Brown, do you show these pictures of the Prophet in your class? I definitely show the pictures from Rashid ad-Din and these pictures from the Ottoman period and Central Asia, because these are not only important pieces of Islamic art. So I show them on my Islamic art in my Islamic art lecture, right? Mm-hmm. But also, if you're dealing with a class on Islamophobia, and I teach classes on Islamophobia or Islam in the West, you also show the pictures from Charlie Hebdo, because people, you can't just say like, there's a really insulting picture of the Prophet and just trust me on it. It's really insulting, right? These are, you have to know what you're dealing
You got
with.
to lay out the facts, essentially,
Yeah.
no matter how distasteful and not horrible.
I mean, and similarly, like this is the same thing Muslim scholars did. Like, for example, the Quran says, like the unbelievers are saying X about the prophet. They say he's a pope. They say he's getting this from some other person's giving this information, right? They say he's et cetera, et cetera. Like, so even if you were to read the Quran, you are literally reciting and repeating insults directed at the prophet. And it's very interesting when you look at, like, especially in the Hanafi school of law, when they talk about and what instances in which non-Muslims, like dhimmis living under Muslim rule, if they insult the prophet, in the Hanafi school of law, that is not automatically like a death penalty offense, or it's actually up to the ruler to decide what to do with the person. Why?
It's a ta'zir issue instead.
Yeah, because that person, by not being Muslim, so the Quran allows them to stay on their religion, right? From Surah At-Tawbah, it allows them, if they pay the jizya, they can continue being Christian or Jewish or Zoroastrian or whatever. But if you know about Islam and you're living amongst Muslims and you still don't accept the prophethood of Muhammad alayhi salam, you are either saying he's a liar or he's crazy or our information about him is unreliable. All of these are insults, right? So what Abu Hanifa and his school say is, like, their religious belief, which they have been Quranically allowed to keep, is more insulting than what they've said about the prophet.
Interesting.
Right? So
I get that tracks, basically.
Yeah, their kufr and their refusal to believe is a much bigger insult than, like, them saying, some sentence that, some insult about the prophet, right? So I think it's important to remember that even if you were to just recite the Quran, you would be repeating an insult about the prophet, right? Even if you were to talk about how Muslim scholars dealt with non-Muslims and people insulting the prophet, you're going to repeat and find this material repeated. So you can't, like, any serious study of the past, even if it's done from a purely Muslim perspective, like in a madrasa, is going to repeat and, regurgitate insulting material. That's why, like, for example, one in hadith, the science of hadith, you're allowed to repeat and reproduce forged hadiths if your purpose is to identify them as forgery and to talk about the issue of forged hadiths, right? You don't just say, there are forged hadiths out there, we can't say what they are, we can't give you examples because it's, you know what I mean? So what these students were asking for, and of course the funny thing is, this was an online class. Like, you can imagine the students are like sitting there looking at their computers. The professor on their syllabus wrote that there's going to be images of religious figures. The professor gave them a trigger warning, told them, if you want, you can leave the room, turn the screen off or whatever.
Yeah.
And they didn't do it. I don't know. Maybe they weren't paying attention, which is probably the case with most students, right? But and then if you see the student when the one who filed the complaint, when she's talking at the CARE Minnesota press conference, she's outraged that she was forced to see a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. First of all, I mean, I've showed these pictures in my class. I never give it trigger. It didn't even occur to me to give a trigger warning because I don't know. I'm kind of old school.
That's going to tie into, like, the next side tangent that I'm going to bring up, because this relates to me to the coddling of the American mind. I haven't read the book, but I'm familiar with the discussion. So continue with your point, though. Go on.
Well, I mean, I think that your point is fine to move on to, which is to say that, okay, there's one angle where you could say, look, people are babies today. Everybody is always being harmed. This speech is harmful. I need a trigger warning. We all know this debate, so I don't need to go too far into it. And I myself definitely am on the side that people shouldn't be coddled. They need to be exposed to different opinions, and that an idea or a speech or an image can't really harm you. I mean, I don't think when you talk about harming students, him hearing something that upsets them or comes from a different perspective, if you say that's harm, then you end up in a situation where nobody can talk about anything that might upset anybody else And in the
Then
end,
why are you even in school to learn anything anyway?
yeah, in the end, you essentially can't say anything because anything you say could potentially be harmful to somebody, and you have a very diverse community. And by the way, there's no notion that someone has to objectively demonstrate that they've been harmed in this way of thinking, right? So all I have to do is say that I'm harmed, and everyone has to accept that. So it leads to, it's like a reductio ad absurdum. I mean, you reach the point where essentially no one would be able to communicate or express any ideas, and then education certainly becomes impossible. Now, somebody could say, "Oh, wait, Professor Brown, but we have a chance. Muslims have a chance to kind of promote their values and to bring American society further in line with what we think, how we think humans should act, which is that we think humans should venerate prophets. We think that they should not depict them, right? So if we can make it so, American universities do not ever show pictures of the Prophet Muhammad or never allow anything bad to be said about the Prophet Muhammad, would that not be a good development? Would we have not done, Amr bil Ma'ruf, enjoining right in our society more broadly? Okay, fair enough, right? I accept that, right? But I'd say there's two problems with that. In fact, I'm not even going to go into the first one. I'll just say the second problem, which is even from that, taking that perspective as the only correct one, right? I would say that what do you do then about diversity within your own tradition? So,
right.
Like, let's say we're never going to, again, I think even, let's say America suddenly became a Muslim country, the Sharia is applied, right? Everybody's Muslim in the country, right? There'd still be, I think, a reason to show the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, because here you're like, look, this is what other people are saying about the Prophet, or saying about Muslims. How do we deal with this? How do we understand this? So you're not talking about then what your in-group is producing or saying some of us produce this image. Like, these are other people outside who are producing from another place or producing these images, and you kind of have to understand them in order to understand what you're up against. The second thing I'd say is, again, even if everybody's following the Sharia, everybody's Muslim, right? You still have dissenting opinions within the Islamic tradition on the issue of depiction, and you still have Muslims who are producing these images in the medieval period. So you would have to be saying that we're just not going to deal with our own history at all, and we're going to pretend it didn't happen. And I think that is foolish, because Islamic history is a repository of wisdom. And there's even when people are making mistakes, you can learn about how they make those mistakes, how they justify those mistakes, how those justifications, what are their weaknesses. So you really, by shutting off even our own history from ourselves, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And especially if you're showing pictures that nobody on earth could possibly say these pictures are insulting the Prophet. Yeah. They are absolutely reverential pictures. Okay.
It's a good point, or an interesting point that he made about even, showing the Charlie Hebdo pictures, and particularly within an academic context. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. This is not just, displaying those images for the sake of provoking other Muslims, right? Just because, or, agreeing to, or supporting people's right to insult Rasulullah, which unfortunately did happen in the Pamela Geller situation. When I think it was actually Linda Sarsour, unfortunately, who said, well, we don't support this, we don't like it, but I will support, because it's freedom of speech, we support their right to be able to do that, which is a different discussion entirely in my perspective. But for Muslims in educational settings, in academia, as you said, like, this is a setting where we're supposed to learn, where we're supposed to be exposed to information for a greater benefit. Like, why else are you there, right? And this is where I think the coddling of the American Muslim mind comes in. And not just American Muslim mind, but the Muslim mind in general, and particularly within an academic setting. As Muslims, whether in the real world or academia, we do need to be more resilient. And just because we're uncomfortable doesn't make something automatically Islamophobic. And I think, very unfortunately, slapping this incident with the Islamophobia label will actually negatively affect other cases of quote unquote real Islamophobia, whether it's on campus or off. It would be very different if this instructor had no real purpose, not even to be like, oh, this is what people have, an example of how people have portrayed the Prophet ﷺ, but in an insulting way, the end. But really, if it was just like, oh, hey guys, look at this kind of thing, you know?
Yeah, this is a real tragedy. This whole thing is a tragedy. And so some people have written about how, we have to understand the Hamline incident against the background of kind of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia in the Twin Cities, and especially against Somalis. And
yeah, I was going to bring that up.
That's fine. I completely accept that, right? But here's the problem. By picking this, people say, well, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Okay, but by picking this issue, which is so clearly not Islamophobic, right? No, I mean, even the university has now issued, the president and the board of trustees has issued a statement just like last night or today or yesterday, I can't remember when, saying we were wrong in using the word Islamophobia. Like, this is not Islamophobic what this professor did, okay? So by doing this, and by essentially what Karen Minnesota was arguing was essentially that all of American society, and certainly higher education, has to abide by Muslim sensibilities about art and depiction.
And it's kind of ridiculous given the wider discussions and societal issues. Like, this is really not it. This is not the mountain or not even the mountain, but the molehill to claim as a mountain to die on.
Yeah,
it's not it.
And it feeds exactly into what the kind of Islamophobic right-wing talking points are, which is Muslims are going to make you follow their religion, right? Which is essentially what CARE Minnesota is asking. They're saying everybody has to abide by Muslim sensibilities on this issue, even if you don't believe them.
National ended up coming out and saying, you know what, forget what we said before, or like what CARE Minnesota said. Actually, no, this was wrong. This was the wrong reaction to have. And yeah, it just really, really feeds into, as you said, already existing Islamophobic narratives. It's shooting ourselves in the foot. It just goes to show that people aren't going to take us seriously, crying wolf, basically.
And then look at all the coverage this issue has gotten.
Yes.
In the, kind of respectable centrist media, in kind of civil liberties media, and then kind of right-wing Islamophobic media, they're all saying the same thing. They all basically say, this is ridiculous. This is insane. This is an insane situation. It's untenable, right? It's unjustifiable. And the kind of the Islamophobic perspective is, see, look how awful Muslims are. The kind of more sympathetic perspective is, yeah, these students had it rough, but this is really unacceptable because this totally compromises academic freedom. So what you end up having is Muslims look like, the Muslim who cried Islamophobia. Mm-hmm. And instead of these students saying, okay, here are like ABC things that have happened to us in the Twin Cities or on campus where we were treated badly because we're Muslim, or we were treated badly because we're Black, or we were treated badly because we're foreign, or we were treated, et cetera, right? Instead of doing that, which would have been really good arguments, for people doing something about Islamophobia or anti-Black racism or something, they end up saying something where, even if you listen to the students and CARE Minnesota's presentation, they don't talk about it. They talk about racism and anti-Blackness when they talk about how people are opposing the university president, who's herself African-American, right? Mm-hmm. But they don't.
And it's not drawn to actual examples of how
what they're talking about is this 100% religious issue. It is 100%. This is against our religion. If you do it, it's Islamophobic. They don't say people are being racist against us. Yeah. They don't say that.
Yeah, and I think it's very important for just Muslims in general to, again, be aware of this, because how this was handled and how we choose to handle similar situations in the future is really going to inform very strongly how we are dealt with elsewhere. And I mean, I'm in school and I have conversations about Islamophobia on a fairly regular basis because I'm going to be going into something similar to social work. So, community work, these discussions come up a lot. But there's a massive, massive difference between, again, identifying real Islamophobia versus, well, I'm uncomfortable or this goes against Islam in some way. Now I'm going to make it everybody else's problem. And this is where that bit about resilience and not being coddled really comes in. Like, if you're in a particular class, you know what the curriculum is, you know what the syllabus is, you know what's been, in this particular example anyway, you've been given advance warning. toughen up, basically, is how I feel about it. Because what are you going to do in the real world where you don't get these warnings? What are you going to do in the real world where you cannot impose? And as you said, even in an ideal Muslim state, we cannot impose certain things upon non-Muslims. And it's just an unhealthy take all around, because it does us a disservice by putting us in an even weaker position than we already generally are as Muslim minorities in the West, and particularly within an academic context. And unfortunately, there's lots of Islamophobia and Orientalism and racism in an academic context, in academic environments, that are very difficult to call out even when they're explicit and clear. So to see something like this, to claim it to be Islamophobia when it really wasn't, and then I really feel for the professor, unfortunately, who got fired over this, because it does impact her really negatively. Imagine how she feels now about these Muslim students. And she's launched a lawsuit against the university, I believe. But all I can think about is this was really bad anti-dawah.
It's really depressing. I mean, the one group that has sort of very reliably supported Muslims and tried to fight against Islamophobia in the US is like professors in academia, and the CARE Minnesota basically made an enemy out of those people, or antagonized those people, and made it very hard for them to kind of align their work as scholars and supporting Muslims.
Any final words on this before we sign off?
I mean, I would just say that, one of the things I've noticed about Muslims discussing this stuff online is, as usual, you need to have higher standards for the way they think about the world around them and sort of process information. The kind of stuff that, if I remember, I wrote and I said online, like, this is not Islamophobic. This is not insulting to Islam or offensive, or, insulting to Muslims. Mm-hmm. And people said, how can you say it's okay to depict the Prophet? I didn't say that. They'll say, how can you say it's okay to show the Charlie Hebdo photos?
Well, that wasn't even in
the picture. I didn't say that, and the professor didn't show them. I mean, so, people need to have just a modicum, the absolute bare minimum of ability to take in information, assess it, analyze it, and then respond. Like, they can't just, it was like a theater of idiocy.
Yes.
And
so many ways.
Unfortunately, I know some of this is just the nature of like online kind of social media and stuff, but I think a lot of Muslims show up on that and express themselves. And if they want to live up to the standards of their tradition and not embarrass themselves in front of others, they should really have higher standards for the way they interact.
Absolutely. And I think that's the valuable takeaway from this entire discussion, is that, as you had pointed out in significant detail, within our own tradition, there is so much diversity, and it's not offensive. And so much of what has happened boils down to that complete ignorance of our own tradition. And then not only do we look like fools to the non-Muslims, but we're betraying our own tradition in so many ways. And the oversensitivity, the jumping to offense when there was neither offense intended nor could it possibly be construed as such, it, again, just harmful to our own cause, betrays our tradition in so many ways, and is a symptom of the expectation that we are to be coddled and catered to at every step of the way. And that's just not how life is going to work, whether in university or elsewhere. So I hope the listeners benefited from this discussion as much as I did. Jazakallah khair for your time. Really appreciate it. I know you're quite busy and you've got classes coming up. So just want to tell you, thank you again for joining us and having this great conversation.
My pleasure. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hey everyone, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on our handle Muslim Matters. And check out our site daily at MuslimMatters.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.